Hello and welcome to day 5 of AP Human Geography with Mr. Bidwell. And this is the final day of Chapter 12, Services. Today's focus is how are rural and urban services formed throughout the world in growing urban areas. That will be your content objective. And a quick review from previous days. Take a moment to reflect on these 3 questions. And today's I can statements, yes, there's 7 of them, so at the end of the lesson you should be able to answer those in your conclusion. 1, describe the difference between clustered and dispersed rural settlements. 2, explain the types of services in early settlements. 3, identify important prehistoric, ancient, and medieval urban settlements. 4, explain the 2 dimensions of urbanization. 5, analyze how clustered services define the difficulty in defining urban areas. 6, compare and contrast meets and bounds settlements with long lot settlements. And lastly, describe how clustering of services increases urban development. All right, starting out, we go back to agriculture, and we can see that all productive agricultural land were used as defense sites. So we go back to Mesopotamia with our first clustered settlements, and those would have been the city of Ur, which is known as the city of fire, found in Mesopotamia. These were agricultural-based communities. They're a collection of houses and farms. And oftentimes within those walled cities, remember the wall delineated them for protection. And oftentimes you will find religious structures as well as other consumer services, such as exchanging of tools and sheds and services from shops. All right, this is the most numerous globally. However, the less numerous is the dispersed rural settlements, and these are usually individual farms that are isolated, and these are common of North America. All right, circular rural settlements that we've seen throughout history. We go back to the von Thunens model and how everything is centered on that agricultural market and extends out in concentric rings outward, much like we see in the Kroll villages in sub-Saharan Africa. And we look at Goendorf in Germany, similar settlements that again start at a core and then they extend outward, usually in rings. All right, let's talk about linear settlements. Linear settlements are going to follow rivers or bodies of water. When they do that, oftentimes that marketplace will be the median between the 2 points of the furthest end of each settlement. So think of an elongated state. The middle point is where you'll see the market. That's where you'll see the services within long lot settlements. The example would be the French landlocked system, as we can see with many French cities today along major rivers, as well as Canadian cities along major rivers, which follows the landlocked river settlement pattern, where we see services at the median. All right, let's talk about some of the rural clustered settlements. These would be found in the northeastern colonial settlements, where we see New England, where most of the clustering will be around the church. There will be a homogeneous landscape. There will be a high density with a common culture called the New England Way. There will be settlement based on grants, and then this will further explain the clustering and high density of these settlements, which explains some of the major cities we see today that came from these clustered early settlements in New England. All right, there's an example you can see with the at the center of the church is the religious, again conforming to that New England way. All right, middle colonies was much more heterogeneous. There was more cultural diversity. And with that, you had individual land acquisitions. So now you're going to have plotted cities different than you would have in the New England areas. And you would see a net immigration into that area because of the diversity. And when population became too clustered, then they would interregionally migrate to the Midwest. And they would set up cities, individual cities along the way based on individual land acquisitions. And here again you can see these dispersed clustered rural settlements. All right, let's take a look. When we talk about long lot systems, there is a better access to transportation and markets. As we learned with transportation, boat, the cheapest and the easiest to form of energy. You can use the flow of the river to take you to and from marketplaces. And meets and bounds are what we see mostly in England. They're created with grid systems. However, we see it in the United States, especially with the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 and again 1787, which creates grid systems. And within those grid systems, you'll see clustering towards the center. All right, quickly think about what we've covered with early settlements. All right, continuing with looking at the United Kingdom. The Enclosure Movement Act, we've talked about it. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. We know it creates efficient farming, and it also creates interregional migration and burgeoning of clustered cities. There's the city of Ur, Mesopotamia. We can see urban settlements throughout, extending from the first early settlements of the Fertile Crescent with the city of Ur. And the early settlements then move into the medieval settlements, and this ties into political geography. So after the collapse of the Roman Empire, large urban settlements were mostly clustered in China. However, when we look at medieval settlements in Europe, they're going to be kingdoms. So they're going to serve lords, and their market centers will be within those kingdoms. And they will show the powerful kingdoms by the tallest buildings or edifices of churches and surrounding walls. And again, here's a timeline looking at urban settlements. When we talk about medieval Europe, European settlements served as powerful centers. But when the decline of those settlements, it led to the rise of other settlements in East Asia. All right, quickly think about what we just talked about. We'll skip that. If you want, this is again a great video on the large interregional migration in China today. This is slide 105, sorry 106. All right, let's get to urbanization. We see rapid growth of urban settlements, so it's two-dimensional, meaning you have population centers, population settlements, and then you have it growing outward. That's urbanization. So it's an increasing number of people living in urban settlements. When we talk about developing countries, we talked about how there is the largest interregional migration, which are forming megacities. Well, we know that developing countries are 8 of the 10 most populated cities forming megacities. In fact, when we look at urbanization today, there are estimations in 2015, there are 436 metropolitan areas, excess of 1 million people. When we get to 2030, there will be 662 million cities. A total of 29 metropolises, which are megacities, will be formed in the world. So think about that. 29 megacities by 2030. That's how fast population is growing. You can see with the numbers listed below here. And then that shows you developed countries currently have 3/4 of their population in urban areas, but the fastest growing is in developing, and they're growing at historically world paces. And the reason, as we've mentioned, is to escape impoverished regions and districts for economic pull factors to industrial manufacturing centers. All right, and that's shown right there. And and I did put that in there. Great. So you have 29 metropolises, which are megacities, and the economic pull factor. And really, it's the race to the bottom because they're being outsourced. Think of the call centers, or think of or the back offices, back offices, call centers, or customer service centers. Those are raised to the bottom, a competing wage. They don't have much leverage in the workplace, so they're going to pay a low wage. They're going to be paid a low wage, and if they object to that low wage, they'll just be fired and replaced by another cheap worker because there's that much population growth in urban areas. So really, it's a race to the bottom. We also see within these megacities, there's slums in the periphery, the outlying areas where there's pollution, lack of sanitation. Example would be the City of the Dead in Cairo. We'll talk more about these slums when we get to urbanization. All right, how do we classify an urban area? Because it's very difficult. Lewis Wirth came up with 3 classifications or characteristics. He said that an urban area is defined by a large population, or large size rather. What is that? Well, that's your relationship contractual, meaning your relationships when you get into an urban area, they're more superficial. They're just exchanges that are contractual services. How can I help you, or what can I get from you? Whereas you get into rural areas, then it's more of a personal contract. He said another way of distinguishing between rural and urban areas is high population densities, meaning there's high competition for land, and we'll talk about this. This is called the bid rent theory, where the most expensive land is near the core of the CBD. And then as you get further out, land gets cheap. And so he says when you see the competition for land, and usually that's the price value of land, that will delineate urban areas from rural areas. And then lastly, he says there's a social heterogeneous group of people. You have greater diversity, greater freedoms. But he also said, well, and again, that diversity can be many things. It can be diversity in language. It can call ethnicity. It can be religion. It can be sexual orientation. It can be socioeconomic status. The diversity can be tremendous in urban areas, but it also can create loneliness or isolationism. And again, it's very difficult to define urban from rural. And when we get to urbanization, urban areas continue to expand, making that blurred lines even more difficult. Making those blurred lines even more difficult. All right, so we can see the distribution of urban areas and make sure we talked about where do we see the fastest growth of urban areas, and those are going to be countries that are in DTM stage 2 and 3. Fast-growing urban areas, with the fastest in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. Okay, and here shows us populations of at least 2 million people. Remember, mega cities are 10 million people or more. Peta cities are 20 million people or more. And remember what we started the notes, that estimations by 2030 there will be 29 mega cities in the world. So cities that have 10 million people or more, and we know where the growth is going to be, and that's in these areas where we see tremendous growth with the escaping of poverty conditions of agricultural regions to economic secondary pull centers, which are large cities in these areas of Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. All right, if you want to look at the urbanization growth, that's slide 112. All right, and that'll take us to the end of the notes. And next week we'll be starting chapter 13, urbanization. And if you want, go ahead and look ahead to the key issues. For the meantime, thank you for a wonderful first week of distance learning, and I hope everyone has an enjoyable weekend. Just think, 2 more chapters and we're done with the content.